In the midst of the Ukrainian War Crisis, there's been a lot of economic and overall instability. So the goals of this video are twofold. One of them is to help you connect with what you've been hearing on the news and the radio. And the second one is to help you connect with what the goals of the leaders around the world really are. So, here are generally the three major rules that world leaders use to help guide their countries. So one of them is to promote economic growth. Second one is to limit unemployment. And last but not least, it is to keep prices stable. Okay, so what does economic growth mean? It sounds like a very vague term, so let me break it down. So it all goes back to GDP. GDP is gross domestic product. It's the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in 1 year. So it's basically what's produced inside of the US, in the US, if you're living in the US. What's not included in the GDP is, for example, intermediate goods, like the tires inside of a car does not count if the car is being sold. Another example of something that's not included in the GDP is a non-production transaction like stocks or bonds. And yeah, so there's multiple ways of calculating this GDP. One of them, and the one that's most commonly taught in college level classes, is GDP is equal to consumer spending plus investment spending plus governmental spending plus exports minus imports. So this is called the Expenditures Approach. There are multiple ways of calculating this GDP. There's another one called the income approach. Let me write that down. This is equal to the rent plus wages plus interest and plus profit. So these are two valid ways of calculating GDP. But in this case, we are using GDP to measure economic growth, and this is the key point. So governments use their GDP generally to figure out if their economy is growing or declining based off previous standards. Now this GDP can be expressed in nominal GDP or real GDP. And what this means is basically nominal is just the number value of GDP, which does not account for inflation. Real GDP is the value that does account for inflation. So this is economic growth, and kind of to give a better example or a better model of this, you can graph this situation for a country. So real GDP can be on the vertical axis and time can be on the horizontal axis. And basically, if you have this general trajectory of how your country's economy is moving, it's usually moving in this type of pattern where there's a peak sometimes and a trough sometimes. And when there's a peak, it's usually referring to inflation. It's an inflationary gap where the space under the curve or under the line is referring to some type of unemployment in the country's economy, which is the next thing we are going to talk about. So this is about economic growth, but there's another second goal that major countries have for their economy, and that is to limit unemployment, which is the thing we just talked about. So let's first define unemployment. So unemployment is actually the workers that are actively looking for a job but are not working or are not employed at a position. And you can also use the unemployment rate to figure out what a country's unemployment looks like. It would be unemployment rate is equal to the number of unemployed people over the number of people in the labor force. And the labor force is basically the number of people who are 16 years of age or older that are willing and able to work. That's the definition of the labor force. So you can use this unemployment rate to figure out what the employment situation is looking like in a country. And there are actually three types of unemployment. One of them is frictional unemployment. And this is basically the temporary unemployment between jobs. So this is a very regular thing. And yeah, it's the one that is, this and the next one are basically expected in an economy somewhat. So while frictional is the temporary unemployment between jobs, the second one is structural unemployment. And this one is when the changes in the labor market makes a laborer's skills obsolete. So suppose someone's a cashier and a robot replaces their job. So this would be a structural employment example. And the third type of unemployment is cyclical unemployment. And this is unemployment that's caused by a recession. And this is the worst type. This is the unemployment we don't want. So these two are fairly expected, but governments really try not to make this type of unemployment happen, the cyclical one. So now, expected. What does expected mean? I thought one of the goals for governments is to limit unemployment. Well, it is to limit unemployment, but obviously there are going to be situations where frictional and structural unemployment is unavoidable. And this is incorporated into the natural rate of unemployment. So when an economy is on full employment or the output is at its maximum, then that means that there is the natural rate of unemployment, or the unemployment rate is equal to this natural rate of unemployment. Now there's a third goal that governments have for economic stability, and this is to limit inflation or keep prices stable. So let's start off with what inflation really means. So inflation is the general rise of prices, which reduces the purchasing power of a dollar, a rupee, or any other currency. So a rise of inflation is generally regarded as a bad thing, but it's something that usually happens at a natural rate. This is something you've probably encountered in your news media or television because of the war crisis right now. And yeah, so this is what it means. It's just a general rise in price level. So when inflation occurs, each dollar value or each currency value will buy fewer goods than before. So if you have this $1 bill and it originally buys one apple, well, after inflation, this $1 will buy less than one apple, maybe half an apple. So you see the point. Inflation is a bad thing because that same dollar will essentially become a little less worthy of buying the same market basket. There are some additional applications to this inflation theory or concept. So let's see the relationship between lenders and borrowers. So a borrower borrows some money from a lender, and the lender will charge some interest, but the lender also knows that there's going to be some inflation during the time period of whatever contract they sign. So they expect this amount of money. But what happens when there's unexpected or higher than normal inflation is that the borrower pays this much, but because of this inflation, this extra inflation, the purchasing power of the money is less than what they should have received. So I could probably draw this a little bit smaller. And there's like a whole art behind this concept. And if you want to learn more about this, you should check out other videos you can find online. Now, how do governments or economic states measure this inflation? Well, there are two common ways. One of them is a consumer price index, the CPI, and another one is the Gdp Deflator. The CPI is basically the price of a market basket over the price of the market basket in a base year. Times 100. And meanwhile, the GDP deflator is the nominal GDP over the real GDP times 100. So nominal means the dollar amount or the currency amount that's not adjusted for inflation, while the real GDP or real of anything means that it is in fact adjusted for inflation. So what's the difference between these two things? So CPI it measures the price of only goods and services that are bought by the consumers, while the GDP deflator is the prices of goods and services that are produced within the borders of whatever country you're looking at. So while this is consumer focused, this is more producer focused. Now, it's always important to figure out the why behind things. So there are three causes of this inflation. Three main causes. Of course, there's more. Economics is just a simplified science. So one of the causes is that the government prints too much money. So for this, let's look at the quantity theory of money identity. So it states that the money supply times velocity of money is equal to the price level times the quantity of output. And the velocity and the output, we consider it as relatively stable. So we see that if the government increases the money supply, then according to this equation or this theory, the price level must increase. So this is one reason why inflation occurs. Okay, another cause of inflation is demand pull inflation. So this is the good type of inflation. When there's a lot of demand, the market forces essentially drive the price up because people want it. And Producers can charge higher because people are willing to pay more for these goods. So this type of inflation, or this reason, is good. But the third reason of inflation is cost push inflation. This essentially is the bad type. So if you had this aggregate supply, or this aggregate model of economics, when there's a negative supply shock, because of this limited supply, producers must charge a higher price. And this is something not because of the demand, not because people want it more, it's because of an inability to produce or give consumers what they want at the desired price. So they must push their prices up. And this is the one we don't want. So this was an overall review about the three. So I hope you took away the three major goals that economic leaders have around the world to maintain economic growth, to limit unemployment, to keep prices stable, or to limit artificial inflation. And I hope this will make you more aware about the current financial and overall situation in the world. Thank you.